He had survived bullets, betrayals, and wars that never made the news. Victor Crane believed nothing in this city could still surprise him. Until the night he was supposed to die. The shot came from the dark, clean and precise, aimed straight at his heart. He never saw the shooter. What he felt instead was a sudden, calculated force slamming into his back, throwing him forward just as the gun fired. When Victor turned, expecting to see one of his men bleeding on the pavement, he froze. It wasn't a bodyguard. It wasn't an enemy. It was the quiet maid who had cleaned his floors for 2 years without ever meeting his eyes. She lay in the rain, blood spreading beneath her, lips trembling as she used her last breath to whisper a single name. One Victor trusted more than anyone alive. In that moment, Victor realized something far more terrifying than the bullet meant for him. The person who saved his life had been hiding the truth inside his home all along. Victor Crane hit the cold stone pavement with a force that knocked the air from his lungs. For a fraction of a second, his mind refused to accept what had just happened. There was no pain, only shock, not from the sound of the gunshot still echoing between the buildings, but from the sudden, deliberate impact against his back, strong, precise, perfectly timed. Someone had driven into him with intention, not panic, as if they had calculated the exact angle, the exact moment, down to a heartbeat. Victor rolled instinctively, his hand already reaching for the weapon hidden beneath his coat. Years of survival had trained his body faster than thought, but when his eyes snapped open, the scene in front of him fractured his instincts completely. The person lying on the rain-soaked stone was not one of his men, not a rival, not an assassin who had failed. It was Grace, the quiet maid who had lived inside his house for 2 years without ever demanding to be seen. The woman who spoke only when spoken to, who kept her eyes lowered, who moved through the halls like a shadow that cleaned, cooked, and disappeared. The kind of presence Victor had never questioned, because power had taught him that some people existed to be invisible. She lay twisted on her side, blood blooming darkly through the pale fabric at her shoulder, the rain diluting it into thin red rivers that ran toward the gutter. Her lips trembled as she struggled for breath, her eyes fluttered open, unfocused, as if the world were already slipping away from her. "Don't. Trust," she whispered. The word broke apart before it could finish. Her body went slack. For the first time in 20 years, Victor Crane froze. The world narrowed to the small, fragile figure bleeding at his feet. The chaos of the street, the shouting, the distant sirens, the echo of running footsteps faded into nothing. There was only her. Only the unbearable wrongness of seeing Grace lying there, broken, when the bullet had been meant for him. He moved without conscious thought. Victor slid one arm beneath her back and the other under her knees, lifting her from the ground. The moment her weight settled into his arms, something inside him twisted painfully. She was too light, unnaturally light, as if she had been surviving on the bare minimum required to exist, not to live. Rain lashed his face as he ran. His shoes custom made, worth more than most people's annual salary, skidded on the slick pavement. But he didn't slow. Blood soaked through his white shirt, warm and sticky against his chest. He could feel her heartbeat through the thin barrier of fabric, faint and uneven, clinging to life one fragile beat at a time. The iron gates of his estate flew open at his approach. His guards stared, stunned, watching their boss sprint through the courtyard with a bleeding woman in his arms. Victor didn't explain. There was no time for questions, no time for disbelief. He cut through the marble halls, leaving a trail of water and blood across the floors Grace herself had polished every morning. The irony struck him only dimly, like a distant echo of guilt he had never learned to recognize. The private medical room lay hidden in a secluded wing of the house, a place Victor had built years ago for emergencies that came with power knife wounds, gunshots, the quiet cost of ruling a city from the shadows. He had never imagined he would carry her through its doors. He laid Grace gently onto the stainless steel operating table. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, she looked even smaller. Her skin had lost its color, drained to a sickly pale blue. Her lips were nearly white. One eyelid fluttered half open, revealing a glassy, unfocused stare that sent a sharp, unfamiliar fear through Victor's chest. He reached for the phone with hands steadier than he felt and dialed his private physician. "Get here now," he said when the line connected. His voice was cold, lethal. "I don't care what you're doing. If she dies, you won't live long enough to regret it." He hung up without waiting for a response. Then he turned back to Grace. For the first time since she had entered his house 2 years ago, Victor Crane truly looked at her. Not the brief, dismissive glance of an employer. Not the automatic indifference of a man accustomed to being served. He saw the sharp lines of her collarbones beneath skin stretched too thin, hands rough with calluses that didn't belong to someone who merely cleaned floors. A faint scar on her wrist. Old, long-heeled, but unmistakable. A mark that spoke of restraint, of pain, of a past no one had ever asked her about. 2 years? She had lived under his roof for 2 years, and he had never learned what she liked, what she feared, where she came from. She had been nothing more than a silent presence moving through his home, and he had accepted that absence of curiosity as normal. Tonight, that silence had almost killed him. She had stepped into a bullet meant for his heart. She had crawled through rain and blood to reach his gate, and he did not even know the full shape of her life. His fingers closed around hers without conscious decision. Her skin was ice cold. His hand trembled. The realization unsettled him more than the gunshot ever could. The doctor arrived less than 15 minutes later, Rain still clinging to his gray hair. He wasted no time with questions. He didn't need them. Years of working for Victor had taught him that explanations were luxuries. Survival was not. Victor stood back as the procedure began, his eyes fixed on the movements of the doctor's hands. He watched the blood, the instruments flashing under the lights, the careful precision as the wound was opened further. Time stretched into something thick and suffocating. When the bullet was finally removed and dropped into the metal tray with a soft, hollow clink, Victor stepped forward. He stared at the twisted piece of metal resting there. A standard round, bent, warped, still crusted with drying blood. That bullet should have torn through his chest. Instead, it had lodged itself in Grace's shoulder. "She'll live," the doctor said quietly. "She lost a lot of blood, but she's strong, strong." The word echoed strangely in Victor's mind as his gaze drifted back to Grace's unconscious form. Before the doctor could leave, he hesitated. "There's something else you should know." Victor looked up. "This woman isn't ordinary." The doctor continued carefully. "Her muscle structure, it's trained, systematically. This isn't the body of a maid, or at least it hasn't always been." Victor's eyes dropped to Grace's wrist again, to the scar he had never noticed. And in that moment, a far more disturbing question settled into his chest. Who had Grace been before she came into his house? And more importantly, why had someone like her chosen to stay invisible at his side for 2 years, until the night she decided to die for him? If this story touched your heart, follow the channel to enjoy many more heart-stirring stories every week. Grace did not wake that night. Victor remained in the medical wing long after the doctor had finished and the instruments had been cleared away. The house settled into its familiar silence, but something fundamental had shifted inside its walls. He sat in the chair beside the bed, his posture rigid, his attention fixed on the steady rise and fall of Grace's chest, as if looking away might tempt fate. She looked different in sleep, not weaker, just unguarded. Without the careful stillness she wore during the day, the quiet discipline that had once read as obedience now revealed itself as restraint. Even unconscious, her body held tension, as though she had been trained never to fully let go. Victor replayed the doctor's words in his mind. Trained. Systematically. Not ordinary. The conclusions pressed in on him from all sides. Unwelcome and undeniable. He had built an empire by noticing details others overlooked. Patterns. Silences. Small deviations that hinted at larger truths. Yet Grace Sullivan had lived inside his house for 2 years without triggering a single alarm in his instincts. That failure unsettled him more deeply than any betrayal ever had. At dawn, he finally left the room. The moment Victor entered his study, Marcus was already waiting. His most trusted lieutenant stood near the desk, tablet in hand, his expression unreadable but tense in a way Victor rarely saw. "I pulled everything from the street cameras," Marcus said quietly. 3 angles? 2 private feeds? 1 city cam. Victor nodded once. "Show me." The footage played without sound, Black and white images flickered across the screen. Victor watched himself walking alone through the street, coat collar turned up against the rain. Posture relaxed in a way he had earned through years of dominance. Then Grace appeared at the edge of the frame. She wasn't running. She moved against the flow of pedestrians with calm precision, slipping through gaps that barely existed. Her eyes never left Victor's back. 30 seconds passed, then 20, then 10. When the shooter stepped out of the alley, Victor felt his jaw tighten. Grace moved before the gun was fully raised. She drove into him from behind, low and fast, her shoulders striking his spine at exactly the right angle. Not enough to knock him unconscious, just enough to force him forward. The muzzle flash bloomed a fraction of a second later. The bullet tore through the space where Victor's head had been. Marcus froze the frame. "That wasn't instinct," he said. "That was calculation." Victor didn't respond. The footage switched to another camera. An alley 2 blocks away. Rain-soaked pavement. Grace stumbled into view, clutching her shoulder, blood already dark against her clothes. 2 figures followed her, larger, faster. Victor watched as Grace turned. The movement was clean, economical. A single flash of metal. One man dropped instantly. The second reached for his gun, and the feed cut to static. Silence settled over the room. "A maid doesn't move like that," Marcus said at last. "No," Victor replied, his voice low. "She doesn't—" Victor shut the tablet off and leaned back in his chair. The image of Grace in the alley burned behind his eyes. The precision, the absence of hesitation. She hadn't panicked. She hadn't screamed. She had acted like someone who had done this before and survived it. "What else?" Victor asked. Marcus hesitated. "Her records are thin. Too thin. No real history before 2 years ago. No family. No long-term address. She appears, when she applies to work here, like she stepped out of empty space." Victor's fingers curled slowly against the desk. That night, Victor returned to the medical wing. Grace was awake. She lay very still, eyes open, staring at the ceiling as if she were counting breaths. Her face tightened the moment she sensed his presence. She tried to sit up, then winced sharply and sank back against the pillows, pain flashing across her features before she could hide it. "You shouldn't move," Victor said. She looked at him then, really looked. Her gaze was steady, guarded, stripped of the softness she showed the rest of the staff. For the first time, Victor saw the woman beneath the silence. "I need to leave," Grace said hoarsely. "No," Victor replied calmly. "You don't—" Her jaw tightened. "You can't keep me here. I'm not keeping you," he said. "I'm asking you to stay." The distinction made her pause. Victor stepped closer to the bed, careful to keep his movements unthreatening. He placed the bent bullet on the table between them. Metal against wood. A quiet sound with enormous weight. "That was meant for me," he said. "And you knew it." Grace's gaze dropped to the bullet. Her fingers twitched, betraying her control. "You followed me," Victor continued. "You anticipated the shot. You moved like someone who had rehearsed that moment more than once." She didn't deny it. Instead, she closed her eyes. "I can't tell you everything," she said quietly. "Not yet." Victor studied her face. The exhaustion etched into her features. The pain she endured without complaint. The discipline that had once seemed like humility. "Then tell me this," he said. "Why now?" Grace opened her eyes again. There was something raw in them, fear. Yes, but also resolve. "Because if I waited any longer," she said, "you would be dead." The words settled between them, heavy and final. Victor realized then that Grace had not saved him out of loyalty, or gratitude, or even compassion. She had done it because she had been preparing for that night. And whatever storm she had walked out of 2 years ago was still following her straight into his life. Grace did not sleep again after Victor left the room. Pain pulsed through her shoulder in slow, punishing waves, but it was nothing compared to the tightening pressure in her chest. She had known this moment would come. She had planned for it. And still, when Victor Crane returned hours later, carrying silence like a weapon, her control nearly shattered. He did not sit this time. He remained standing near the foot of the bed, his presence filling the room without effort. The man who ruled Chicago's underworld did not need to raise his voice to command attention. His stillness was enough. Grace broke first. "I was robbed," she said quickly, her voice rough but steady. "On my way home. They took my purse, They shot me. I panicked and ran. I didn't know where else to go." She forced herself to meet his eyes as she spoke, offering the lie cleanly, without hesitation. It was a practiced instinct, one she had relied on for years. Victor listened without interruption. When she finished, he stepped forward and placed the tablet on the table beside her bed. He tapped the screen once. The video began to play. Grace felt the room tilt. There she was, caught in black and white, moving through the crowd with intent carved into every step. Victor paused the footage just before the gun appeared. 30 seconds, he said quietly. "That's how long you were behind me before the shot." He advanced the video. Grace watched herself slam into Victor's back, watched the bullet tear past empty air, watched her own body twist as the impact ripped through her shoulder. Her throat tightened. Victor switched to another angle. The alley. The chase. The moment she turned, he stopped the video just before the blade flashed. "A robbery doesn't look like this," Victor said. Grace's hands clenched beneath the blanket. The lie collapsed under the weight of evidence she could not argue against. She looked away, her breathing shallow and controlled, as though that control were the only thing holding her together. "I didn't plan for you to see that," she whispered. Victor studied her profile. "You planned for everything else." Silence stretched between them, taut and fragile. "You followed me," he continued. "Not accusing, simply stating. You calculated the timing. You knew where I would be, and after you were shot, you fought men trained to kill." Grace closed her eyes. The room smelled of antiseptic and rain. For a moment, she was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere darker, narrower, where walls pressed in and silence meant survival. She forced herself back. "I wasn't watching you," she said at last. "I was watching someone else." Victor's gaze sharpened. "Who?" Grace hesitated, not because she didn't know the answer, but because saying it would change everything. "I can't tell you," she said. "Not yet." Victor's jaw tightened, but he didn't push. Instead, he reached into his pocket and placed something else beside the tablet. The bullet. Metal caught the light, dull and misshapen. A physical reminder of how close death had come. "That bullet was meant for me," he said. "You knew it was coming, and you still stepped in front of it." Grace looked at the bullet, then at him. Her eyes glistened, but no tears fell. She had learned long ago how useless tears could be. "I didn't have a choice," she said. Victor leaned closer, his voice dropping. "Everyone has a choice." She laughed softly, the sound brittle, not always. The words slipped out before she could stop them, carrying more truth than she had intended. Victor caught it instantly. He straightened. "How long have you been preparing for that night?" Grace's fingers relaxed. The fight drained from her all at once, leaving behind something dangerously close to exhaustion. 2 years, she admitted. Victor went still. "From the moment I walked into your house," she continued quietly. "I knew it would end like this. I just didn't know when." The admission hung in the air, heavy and irreversible. Victor turned away, pacing once across the room. 2 years. Every morning she had passed him in the hall. Every night she had returned to a room he had never entered. All that time, she had been waiting for a single moment, one violent, decisive moment. "When I hired you," he said slowly, "you were just a name on a file." Grace nodded. That was the point. Victor stopped at the window, staring out at the pale light creeping across the estate grounds. And now Grace swallowed. "Now I've failed." He turned back sharply. "You saved my life." Her smile was faint, almost sad. "Only for now." The implication struck harder than any accusation. Victor stepped closer again, lowering himself into the chair beside her bed. For the first time, his voice lost its edge. "What happens next?" he asked. Grace hesitated, then spoke with careful precision. "Next, someone will realize I'm still alive, and when they do, they won't make the same mistake twice." Victor studied her face, the tension beneath the calm. the strength layered over fear. "Who are you running from?" he asked quietly. Grace closed her eyes. "Not who," she corrected. "What?" She fell silent after that, retreating behind a wall he could feel but not breach. Victor understood then that whatever she had escaped was not finished with her. And by saving his life, Grace had done something far more dangerous than step into a bullet. She had brought that danger straight into his world. Victor rose slowly, decision settling into his posture like armor. "Then we'll face it," he said. Together, Grace opened her eyes, startled. "You don't know what you're offering," she said. Victor met her gaze, unwavering. "I know exactly what it costs." And in that moment, Grace realized the most dangerous thing of all was no longer the secret she carried, but the man who had just chosen to stand beside her without knowing its full weight. Grace's condition stabilized over the next 2 days, but nothing else in the house did. Victor ordered the medical wing sealed off from the rest of the estate. No staff entered without his permission. No calls went unanswered. No cameras were left unchecked. To the outside world, life continued as usual: meetings, negotiations, shipments moving through the city like veins beneath its skin. Inside the house, however, a quiet vigilance took hold, sharp and unrelenting. Grace felt it even when she slept. She woke often, heart racing, senses stretched thin, as if waiting for footsteps that never came. Each time, Victor was there, not hovering, not watching, simply present in the way only powerful men could be. He sat near the window or leaned against the wall, always positioned so he could see the door, always between her and the rest of the world. It unsettled her more than any threat. On the third night, the pain finally dulled enough for her mind to wander somewhere dangerous. "You should let me go," she said softly, breaking the silence. Victor didn't look at her. "You're not ready." "I will never be ready," she replied. "That's how this ends." He turned then, his gaze steady, unyielding. "That's how it ended before." "Not now." Grace laughed under her breath. "You don't understand the difference." Victor stepped closer, lowering himself into the chair beside her bed. The distance between them felt suddenly intimate, charged with something neither of them named. He studied her face, the fine lines of exhaustion, the control that never quite slipped. "Then help me understand," he said. She hesitated. Every instinct screamed against it, but exhaustion had a way of loosening even the tightest discipline. "There are people who don't forgive survival," Grace said slowly. "They see it as defiance." Victor nodded once. "And they're looking for you." "Yes, and they know you were in my house." Her silence answered him. Victor leaned back, absorbing the implication. Anyone hunting Grace would eventually cross paths with him, and anyone bold enough to move against him had already proven they didn't fear consequences. "You said you were watching someone else." He said, "Not me." Grace's fingers curled against the blanket. "I didn't expect you to connect that so quickly." "I don't miss patterns," Victor replied, "especially when they're standing in front of me." She exhaled slowly. The truth pressed against her ribs, sharp and unforgiving. She had known this moment would come, too. She just hadn't known how heavy it would feel. "There's a reason I took this job," she said. "A reason I stayed invisible." Victor waited. "I wasn't hiding from you," she continued. "I was hiding behind you." The admission shifted something between them. Victor felt it like a subtle change in air pressure. "From whom?" he asked. Grace swallowed. "Someone close to you." The words landed quietly, too quietly. Victor's posture stiffened, every instinct sharpening at once. "Be careful," he said evenly. "What you imply carries weight." "I know," Grace replied. "That's why I didn't want to say it." Silence stretched. The hum of medical equipment filled the space between them, steady and merciless. Victor stood and walked to the window, his back to her. Rain traced thin lines down the glass, mirroring the city beyond. He spoke without turning. "You followed me because you believed someone in my circle wanted me dead." "Yes, and you were right." Grace closed her eyes. There was no retreat left. "You trust him," she said softly. "You always have." Victor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Trust is not the same as blindness." "No," she agreed. But it makes blindness easier. He turned then, his gaze cutting through the dim light like steel. Say it! Grace's heart pounded. This was the cliff's edge. One step forward and nothing could be undone. Julian, she said. The name fell into the room and shattered the silence. Victor did not react. Not outwardly. But Grace saw it, the brief flicker in his eyes, the way his shoulders locked, the fraction of a breath he did not take. My brother, he said quietly. Yes. The word tasted like blood in her mouth. He's been planning it for over a year, Grace continued, her voice steadier now that the truth was free. He believes you've grown weak, that your rules limit what this empire could become. Victor turned away again, hands braced against the window frame. The city lights reflected faintly in the glass, fractured and distant. And you? He asked. Where do you fit into his plans? I wasn't supposed to, she replied. I was collateral, something he didn't account for. Victor laughed once, harsh and humorless. He underestimated you. So did you, Grace said gently. The words lingered, not as accusation, but as truth. Victor returned to her side, his expression unreadable. Why didn't you come to me? Because I didn't know if you'd believe me, she answered. And because if I was wrong, I would have signed my own death warrant. And now Grace met his gaze, something raw breaking through her composure. Now I've done worse. I've put a target on your back and mine. Victor studied her for a long moment. Then he did something she did not expect. He reached out and covered her hand with his own. The contact was brief but deliberate, grounding in a way that sent a quiet shock through her system. You didn't put it there, he said. It was already aimed. Their eyes locked. In that instant, Grace understood something that frightened her more than Julian ever could. Victor Crane was not angry. He was calculating. And calculation, when paired with loyalty betrayed, was infinitely more dangerous than rage. Outside the medical wing, the house remained silent. But beneath that silence, the foundations of an empire were beginning to crack, and both of them stood directly over the fault line. Victor did not confront Julian. That alone unsettled Grace more than any raised voice or threat could have. After the name was spoken, after the truth settled like ash between them, Victor moved with a frightening calm. He left the medical wing without another word, issued quiet orders to his security team, and returned to his empire as if nothing had fractured beneath its surface. Grace watched him go with a tightening in her chest. She had expected rage, denial, a demand for proof. Instead, Victor Crane had chosen silence, and silence, in his world, was never empty. Hours passed. Then a day. When Victor returned, it was late. The estate lay hushed under the weight of night, and the lights in the medical wing were dimmed to a soft glow. Grace was awake, staring at the ceiling, tracing patterns she pretended were meaningless. She sensed him before she heard him. His presence carried a gravity that bent the air around it. He stopped beside her bed, not close enough to touch, not far enough to retreat. I need to ask you something, Victor said. She turned her head slowly, bracing herself. If this is about proof, it's not. That stopped her. Victor's gaze was steady, but there was something new in it now. Not suspicion, not calculation, something closer to uncertainty. Why did you stay? He asked. 2 years is a long time to hide in plain sight. Grace inhaled, then exhaled carefully. This question was more dangerous than any accusation. It reached past the bullet, past Julian, past the lies she had built her survival on. I didn't intend to, she said quietly. Not at first. Victor waited. When I came here, she continued, I only needed time. Somewhere I wouldn't be watched. Somewhere powerful enough that no one would look too closely. And you chose my house? Yes. Because of Julian. Grace nodded. Because he trusted you. And because everyone else was afraid of you. Victor absorbed that in silence. But staying wasn't part of the plan. She went on. I was supposed to leave after a few months. Disappear again. What changed? Grace hesitated. The memory surfaced uninvited, sharp and vivid. Something you did, she said. Victor frowned slightly. I don't remember doing anything for you. I know, she replied. You didn't do it for me. She shifted against the pillows, pain flaring briefly before she pushed through it. Her voice remained steady, but her hands betrayed her, fingers curling tightly into the blanket. 3 years ago, she said, you shut down a shipment moving through the south side. Not weapons, not money, people. Victor's eyes darkened. He remembered that night. A quiet decision, one of many he had made without ceremony. You had the warehouse burned. Grace continued. You pulled your men out. You let the authorities find what was left. You lost territory because of it. Victor nodded once. It crossed a line. That decision saved a child. She said. The words landed softly, but the impact was immediate. He was someone I loved. Grace added. The only family I had left. Victor felt something shift inside him. Subtle, but undeniable. He had never asked what the consequences of that choice had been beyond numbers and maps. I didn't know. He said, I never expected you to, Grace replied. But when I saw your name on the news, when I realized where Julian was positioned, I understood something. She met Victor's gaze fully now. You weren't the monster people said you were, and that made you dangerous to someone like him. Victor leaned back slightly, crossing his arms. So you stayed to protect him, to protect what he represented. She corrected. Limits, rules, lines that couldn't be crossed. Silence filled the room again, heavier than before. And Julian Victor asked. Grace's expression hardened. Julian believes power should be used without restraint. He thinks mercy is weakness. He wants everything you refuse to touch. Victor closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, something old and wounded flickered through. You watched him for 2 years, he said. Right under my roof? Yes, and you never came to me. Grace's voice softened. Because if I was wrong, you would have destroyed me. And if I was right, you would have been forced to choose. Victor looked away. That choice was never supposed to be mine to force. She added, I only meant to delay it. Long enough to stop him. And instead, Victor said quietly, you stepped into a bullet. Grace's lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. That wasn't part of the plan. He studied her for a long moment. The woman who had lived silently in his house, who had bled for him, who had carried a truth heavy enough to break empires. You risked your life, he said, not because you owed me anything, but because you believed in something I barely remember choosing. Grace looked away, emotion tightening her throat. I needed to believe it still mattered. Victor stepped closer, his voice lowering. It does. Their eyes met, the space between them charged with an intimacy neither had anticipated. It wasn't romance, not yet. It was recognition. 2 people standing on opposite sides of power, finally seeing each other clearly. There's something else you should know, Grace said suddenly. Julian doesn't think I'm a threat. Victor's brow furrowed. Why not? Because he believes I'm already broken, she replied. Someone he discarded a long time ago. Victor's jaw tightened. Then he's wrong. Grace studied him, searching for doubt. She found none. What happens now, she asked. Victor straightened, resolve settling into him like steel. Now we don't confront him. We don't accuse. We wait. And when he moves again, Victor's gaze hardened. He will. Grace felt a chill, not of fear, but of certainty. For the first time since she had entered Victor Crane's house, she realized she was no longer hiding behind his power. She was standing beside it, and that, she knew, would change everything. Grace was moved out of the medical wing on the 4th night, not back to the servants' quarters, not to any place that carried the weight of her old invisibility. Victor placed her in a guest suite on the upper floor, one that overlooked the inner courtyard and had only one entrance. The decision was quiet, delivered without explanation, but Grace understood its meaning immediately. She was no longer someone to be hidden. She was someone to be protected. That realization unsettled her more than the pain in her shoulder ever could. Victor did not give orders in her presence. He asked questions, short ones, precise, never more than necessary. He did not push for details she had already refused to give, but he watched everything: her posture when guards passed, the way her eyes tracked exits, the subtle tension that returned whenever Julian's name surfaced in conversation. They began to share space cautiously, like two people circling in unfamiliar terrain, neither fully trusted. At night, Victor sat across from her at the small table by the window. Reports spread between them. Grace listened as he spoke of shipments, alliances, pressure points within the city. She said little, but when she did, it was never wasted. A single observation from her could shift the direction of an entire discussion. Victor noticed. "You think like someone who's seen systems collapse," he said once. Grace didn't look up from the document she was reading. "I think like someone who survived when they did." Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. Something unspoken passed between them, respect edged with restraint. Julian, meanwhile, began to move, not openly, not yet. He sent messages, casual ones, invitations to dinner, notes laced with concern about Victor's health, his sudden withdrawal from public appearances. On the surface, it was affection. Beneath it, Victor felt the probing pressure of a man testing for weakness. "He's checking whether I'm wounded," Victor said quietly one evening. Grace nodded. "And whether I'm still alive." That was when Victor decided she would attend the next meeting. Not as staff, not as an afterthought. She would sit beside him. The announcement rippled through the house in silence. Grace felt the shift immediately, the looks that lingered too long. The guarded curiosity. Power structures didn't change without consequence. And Victor Crane was not known for elevating anyone without reason. The night of the meeting arrived heavy with rain. Julian entered the room with his familiar smile, polished and effortless. His gaze flicked across the table, then stopped when he saw Grace. For just a moment, something sharpened behind his eyes. Then it vanished. "Grace," he said smoothly, "I didn't realize you were back on your feet." She met his gaze calmly. "I heal quickly." Julian smiled wider. "So I see." Victor watched the exchange closely. The tension was subtle, nearly invisible, but it was there. Grace held herself differently now. No lowered gaze, no retreat. Julian noticed. He always noticed. Dinner passed with measured conversation. Business, territory, neutral ground. Julian spoke of expansion with careful restraint, offering ideas that danced near the lines Victor had always refused to cross. Victor declined each one calmly. Grace felt Julian's attention turn toward her, probing, curious. When she spoke, she chose her words with surgical precision. Never enough to reveal. Never enough to retreat. Later that night, when Julian finally left, Victor exhaled slowly. "He knows," Grace said. "Yes," Victor agreed, "but he doesn't know how much." They stood in the quiet aftermath, the room stripped of pretense. "Why did you bring me in like that?" Grace asked softly. Victor turned to her. "Because if he believes you're still insignificant, he'll underestimate you. And if he believes you matter, he'll make a mistake." Grace absorbed that. "You're using me. I'm trusting you," Victor replied. "There's a difference." The words lingered, heavier than any promise. Over the following days, their alliance solidified in silence. Grace began assisting with internal security reviews, her insights uncovering vulnerabilities. Victor's own people had missed. He adjusted routes, shifted loyalties, tightened the circle around Julian without closing it. All the while, something quieter grew between them. Victor noticed the way Grace steadied when he entered a room, the way she relaxed just enough to breathe. Grace noticed the way Victor listened, not just to her words, but to what she avoided saying. Their proximity became habitual, comforting in ways neither acknowledged. Late one night, as rain tapped softly against the windows, Grace spoke without looking at him. "If this ends badly," she said, "you should let me go." Victor's response was immediate. "That's not an option." She finally turned. "It should be." He held her gaze. "You didn't walk into my life to be discarded when things turn inconvenient." Grace swallowed. "People like me don't get that luxury." Victor stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Then let me be the first mistake you make." The intimacy of the moment startled them both. Grace looked away first, pulse racing. Julian made his move the following morning. A shipment disappeared. A trusted lieutenant was found bleeding in an alley, not dead, but broken enough to send a message. The Castellano name surfaced in whispers across the city. Grace stood beside Victor as the news came in. "He's escalating," she said. "He wants to force your hand." Victor's jaw tightened. "Then we don't give it to him." Grace met his gaze. "This will get ugly." Victor didn't look away. It already is. As the city shifted under mounting pressure, Grace realized something that frightened her more than Julian ever could. She was no longer planning her escape. She was planning how to stay. And Victor Crane, whether he admitted it or not, was beginning to rely on her in ways that had nothing to do with strategy, and everything to do with trust. Julian stopped pretending a week later. The warning signs came quietly, at first accounts frozen without explanation. A trusted supplier suddenly unreachable. A security route compromised in a way that could not be accidental. None of it was enough to start a war. All of it was enough to signal intent. Grace noticed the pattern before Victor did. "He's isolating you," she said one night as they stood over a map of the city spread across Victor's desk. Her finger traced a slow circle around the southern districts. "Not attacking. Not yet. He's cutting support and waiting to see what you do." Victor studied the map in silence. "He wants me to react." "Yes," Grace replied. "And if you do, he'll paint you as unstable, dangerous, unfit." Victor's mouth curved into a humorless smile. "And if I don't, then he'll force your hand." The knock came less than an hour later. Marcus entered without ceremony, his face tight. "There's been an incident." Victor didn't look surprised. "Where downtown?" One of Julian's men cornered Grace's former supervisor, the one who processed her hiring paperwork. Grace felt the room tilt. "Is he alive?" she asked. "For now," Marcus said. But the message was clear. Victor's gaze snapped to Grace. "He's testing you." "He's confirming," Grace corrected quietly. "He wants to know if I matter." Victor turned away, anger coiling tightly beneath his control. "I told him nothing about you." "You didn't need to," Grace said. "He knows you. He knows what you protect." The realization settled heavily between them. Grace was no longer a secret. She was leverage. Victor straightened. "Then we adjust." "How?" Grace asked. Victor met her gaze. "We give him something to chase." The plan was simple, dangerous, precisely the kind Julian would never resist. A public appearance. Victor announced a charity gala. 3 nights later, high profile, carefully timed, impossible to ignore. An event meant to display strength, stability, control. Grace's name appeared on the guest list beside his. Julian accepted the invitation within minutes. The night of the gala, the estate shimmered with light and illusion. Music flowed, laughter echoed. Power gathered behind polished smiles and tailored suits. Grace stood at Victor's side in a dress that concealed more than it revealed, her posture calm, her senses alert. Julian approached with effortless confidence. "Brother," he said warmly, "you look well." "So do you," Victor replied. Julian's gaze flicked briefly to Grace. "I see you've promoted the help." The insult was deliberate. Grace smiled faintly. "I see you've perfected your timing." Julian's eyes sharpened for a fraction of a second before he laughed. "Still sharp. I admire that." Victor watched the exchange closely. Beneath the surface pleasantries, tension wound tight as wire. The night unfolded slowly. Too slowly. Grace felt it just before it happened, the subtle shift in air, the instinctive warning that had kept her alive through worse nights than this. She leaned toward Victor, her voice barely audible. "We need to leave. Now." Victor didn't hesitate. He turned, already signaling security. That was when the lights cut out. Screams erupted as darkness swallowed the room. Glass shattered. Chaos surged. Grace moved instinctively, pulling Victor down behind a marble column as a shot rang out close enough to feel the heat of it pass. The lights flickered back on seconds later. Too late. A body lay sprawled across the dance floor. One of Victor's allies, blood staining the polished stone. Julian stood frozen near the center of the room, shock etched across his face. Perfectly staged. "Victor," he said hoarsely, This wasn't supposed to happen." Grace felt the lie ripple beneath his words. Security flooded the room. Sirens wailed in the distance. Within minutes, The narrative began to form. An event meant to display control turned into proof of instability. Whispers spread like wildfire. Julian turned to Grace as medics rushed past. His voice dropped, venomous beneath the concern. "You should have stayed invisible." Grace met his gaze steadily. "You should have aimed better." The words were reckless, honest. Julian smiled thinly. "Careful." Victor placed a hand at the small of her back, a silent warning and a promise in one. "This conversation is over." They left the gala under escort, the city buzzing behind them. Back at the estate, silence pressed in hard and unforgiving. Victor paced the length of his study, restraint finally cracking. He crossed a line. Victor said, publicly, "Yes." Grace agreed. "And now he expects you to retaliate." Victor stopped, turning to her. "He used you." Grace's expression softened, but only briefly. "He tried." The room fell quiet. Then Victor spoke again, slower now. "He will come for you next." Grace didn't deny it. "He already has." Victor closed the distance between them. His voice dropped. "Then you won't face him alone." Grace searched his face. "This is where people like me usually disappear." Victor's gaze was unwavering. "Not this time." The words carried more weight than any vow. Outside, the city reeled from the shock of the night's violence. Alliances shifted, lines hardened. Julian had made his move, and in doing so, he had forced Victor into a corner he could no longer retreat from. Grace understood then that the game had changed irrevocably. This was no longer about exposure or secrets. It was about survival. And for the first time since she had entered Victor Crane's world, Grace felt the terrifying certainty that if one of them fell, the other would follow. The city did not sleep after the gala. By morning, the headlines were already forming, carefully worded, strategically vague. Violence at a Crane-hosted event. An ally dead. Questions raised about leadership and control. Julian's influence worked quietly behind the scenes, guiding speculation without ever touching it directly. Victor watched the reports in silence from his study, his expression carved from stone. Grace stood near the window, arms folded, listening not to the news, but to the subtle rhythms of the house. Too many guards repositioned. Too many whispers cut short when she entered a room. "He's tightening the net," she said. "Not around you." Victor looked at her. "Around you." Grace nodded. "He doesn't want you dead yet. He wants you weakened, distracted. If I disappear, he wins twice." Victor's jaw flexed. "You're not bait." "I already am," Grace replied calmly. "The only question is whether we pretend otherwise." Silence settled, sharp and brittle. That afternoon, the first message arrived. It wasn't a threat, not directly. A small envelope slipped past security and placed neatly on Grace's bedside table while she slept. Inside was a photograph, grainy, taken from a distance, a familiar street, a familiar door, the orphanage. Grace's breath caught as she stared at the image. Julian had found it, or perhaps he had always known and was only now choosing to reveal it. Victor read the note beneath the photograph once, then folded it carefully. "He wants you to panic," he said. Grace forced her hands to steady. "He wants me to run. And you won't?" She met his gaze. "I will if it protects them." The admission struck harder than the gunshot ever had. Victor crossed the room in 2 strides. "You leave now. He follows. You vanish. He hunts. This ends one way only." Grace swallowed. "People die in that ending." "Yes," Victor said quietly, "but not without a fight." The second message came at night. A call, anonymous, distorted. "You were never meant to survive," the voice said smoothly. "You should have stayed broken." Grace said nothing. "You think standing beside him makes you safe." Julian continued, "It makes you visible. And visibility has consequences." The line went dead. Victor heard the call from the doorway. He didn't speak until Grace set the phone down. "He's escalating," she said. "He's impatient," Victor replied. "That's a weakness." Grace turned toward him. "He knows how to use me against you." Victor didn't deny it. "Then we stop reacting. We lead." That night, Victor revealed the plan. Not to trap Julian, not yet. To expose him indirectly. Victor would withdraw. Step back from certain operations. Create the illusion of instability. Julian could not resist exploiting. Grace would disappear from public view entirely. You want him to believe he's already won, Grace said. I want him to move without caution, Victor replied. And me? Victor hesitated. Just for a moment. You'll be safer. Grace searched his face. You don't believe that. No, he admitted. But you'll be protected. Grace laughed softly. You can't guard someone who refuses to be a target. The argument lingered unresolved, tension threading tightly between them. By the third day, the trap was set. Victor canceled meetings, shifted territory, allowed rumors to spread unchecked. Julian responded exactly as predicted, taking ground Victor abandoned, consolidating influence, moving faster, bolder. And then he made his mistake. Grace learned about it from Marcus, his voice tight as wire. Julian moved funds through a shell account tonight. Castellano linked. We traced it. Victor's eyes sharpened. That's not like him. He thinks you're distracted. Grace said. He thinks I'm gone. Victor turned to her. Are you ready? Grace nodded, though her pulse thundered. I've been ready since the night he decided I was disposable. They moved quickly. Grace left the estate before dawn, disguised, unremarkable. Victor watched from the security monitors as her car disappeared into the city, a familiar ache tightening in his chest. He had sent people into danger before. This was different. This time, the danger had a name, a face, a voice he had begun to trust. Hours passed. Then the call came. Grace's voice was calm but strained. He took the bait. Where? An old warehouse by the river. Castellano territory? Victor closed his eyes briefly. Get out! I can't, Grace replied. He's here. The line crackled. A voice filtered through Julian's, unmistakable. You really thought you could disappear again? He said lightly. You always did like dramatic exits. Victor's grip tightened on the desk. Grace, listen to me. I am, she replied quietly. But this is something I have to finish. The call ended. Minutes later, Victor's phone lit up with a message. A single line. Come alone, or she dies. The room went silent. Marcus stepped forward. It's a trap. Victor didn't look at him. Of course it is. Grace had warned him this moment would come. The moment when Julian would stop circling and strike straight at the heart of Victor's restraint. Victor reached for his coat. You can't go alone, Marcus said. Victor paused, his voice steady and lethal. He thinks he knows me. He glanced once at the darkened screen, at the woman who had stepped into a bullet for him without hesitation. He doesn't, Victor continued. And neither does she. Outside, the city waited, breath held. As Victor Crane walked straight into the trap his brother had built, fully aware that whatever happened next would decide not only the fate of his empire, but the woman who had become its most dangerous truth. The warehouse by the river stood abandoned, its windows dark, its silhouette jagged against the pale wash of dawn. Victor arrived alone, exactly as instructed. He left his phone in the car, his weapon hidden but ready, his expression carved from the kind of calm that came only when all other options had already been burned away. Inside, the air smelled of rust and old water. Footsteps echoed, slow and deliberate. Grace was seated on a metal chair near the center of the space, her hands bound loosely in front of her, her posture straight despite the tension radiating through her body. She looked up when Victor entered. For a moment, something flickered across her face, relief, fear, and something deeper that neither of them had ever allowed to surface fully. You shouldn't have come, she said quietly. Victor didn't slow. You told me once you couldn't leave this unfinished. I didn't mean like this. Before he could respond, applause cut through the silence. Julian stepped out of the shadows, impeccably dressed, a smile resting easily on his lips. Behind him, two men stood watch, weapons visible but unraised. Julian's gaze moved between Victor and Grace with open satisfaction. You always did have a flair for drama, Julian said. I wondered which of you would break first. Victor stopped a few feet from Grace. Let her go. Julian laughed softly. You see, straight to the point, you never did enjoy the game. Grace's fingers tightened around the restraints. "This ends with me," she said. "Not him." Julian tilted his head, studying her. "You always thought too highly of your own importance." Victor spoke then, his voice low and even. "You planned everything carefully. Except this." Julian raised a brow. "Oh, you assumed she was my weakness?" Victor continued. "That I'd lose control." Julian smiled. "Was I wrong?" Victor met his brother's gaze. "You were incomplete, in a single fluid motion." Victor stepped aside. At the same time, the warehouse light snapped on, flooding the space with harsh white glare. Doors slammed shut. Footsteps thundered from the shadows. Marcus and Victor's men emerged from every angle, weapons trained, positions perfect. Julian's smile faltered. "You traced the accounts," Victor said calmly. "The shell companies, the Castellano connections. Every message you thought was hidden." Julian's expression hardened. "You wouldn't dare move against me like this." Victor took another step forward. "I already have." Grace felt the tension ease just enough for breath to return. But the danger wasn't gone, not yet. Julian's gaze slid back to her, sharp and calculating. "You think you won," he said softly. "But you're still the same man you always were." Victor. Afraid to cross the lines I was willing to erase. Victor didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice carried no anger, only resolve. "No," he said. "I learned where they mattered." He turned to Grace. "This is your choice." The words startled her more than the ambush ever had. Victor continued. "You came here to stop him, to protect something you believed in. I won't take that from you." Julian laughed sharply. "You're giving her power now." Victor didn't look away from Grace. "I already did." The silence that followed was heavy, expectant. Grace met Julian's gaze. For the first time, there was no fear in it, only clarity. "You don't get to decide who I am anymore," she said, "or who survives you." Julian sneered. "And what will you do?" "Kill me." Grace shook her head slowly. "No, I'll let you live with what you tried to become." She turned to Victor. "End it." Victor nodded once. Julian was arrested quietly, efficiently. There were no dramatic speeches, no last-minute escapes. The empire he had tried to steal collapsed inward, stripped of allies who vanished the moment his protection disappeared. When the warehouse finally emptied, Grace stood alone near the open doors, the river glinting pale and endless beyond. Victor approached her slowly, careful now in a way he hadn't been before. "It's over," he said. Grace exhaled, a sound that carried 2 years of tension with it. "No," she replied softly. "It's finished." Victor studied her face, the strength, the exhaustion, the woman who had survived more than anyone had ever known. "You don't have to disappear anymore," he said. Grace looked away, emotion tightening her throat. "I don't know how to stay." Victor stepped closer, stopping just short of touching her. "Then we learn." Their eyes met, the space between them filled with something fragile and real. Not a promise, not yet, but the possibility of one. As dawn broke fully over the river, Grace realized she wasn't afraid of the future for the first time in years, and Victor Crane understood that power. Once stripped of fear and secrecy, could finally make room for something else, something that might last. The city felt different after Julian fell. Not quieter. Chicago was never quiet, but steadier, as if a long-held breath had finally been released. The headlines shifted quickly, as they always did. A betrayal uncovered, a power struggle resolved, a dangerous man removed before he could burn everything down. To the world, it was another story. To Victor Crane, it was the end of the last illusion he had allowed himself to keep. Grace stayed away from the estate for 3 days. Not because Victor asked her to leave. He didn't. He made no demands at all. He only told her that whatever choice she made next would be hers alone, untouched by debt or obligation. That freedom frightened her more than captivity ever had. She slept in borrowed rooms, woke to unfamiliar ceilings, walked streets without looking over her shoulder for the first time in years. The city no longer felt like a maze of exits and ambushes. It felt open. And openness, Grace realized, was something she had never learned how to navigate. On the 4th morning, she returned. Victor was in the garden when she found him, jacket draped over a chair, sleeves rolled back, hands dusted with soil as he knelt beside a young olive tree newly planted in the earth. The sight stopped her cold. This was not the man she had first met, the distant, untouchable figure carved from power and silence. This was someone quieter, someone building instead of guarding. He sensed her presence before she spoke. "You didn't have to come back," Victor said, standing slowly. Grace met his gaze. "I wanted to." They stood there for a moment, the space between them filled with everything that no longer needed to be said. The secrets, the fear, the careful distance that had once defined every interaction between them. "I shut down the remaining Castellano routes," Victor said eventually. "All of them. Permanently." Grace nodded. "There will be consequences." "There always are," he replied. "But some lines don't move once you draw them." She studied him. "You changed." Victor gave a faint smile. "So did you." Grace looked away, emotion stirring unexpectedly in her chest. "I don't know who I am without something chasing me." Victor stepped closer, not into her space, but near enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence. "Then you don't have to decide today." She laughed softly. "You make it sound simple." "It isn't," he said. "But it's honest." That afternoon, Victor handed over control of several operations he had once guarded obsessively. He delegated. He stepped back. Power, Grace saw, did not loosen its grip on him because he was losing it, but because he no longer needed to cling to it in the same way. In the evenings, they walked the grounds together, not as employer and subordinate, not as strategist and weapon, just two people learning the shape of quiet. Sometimes they spoke of the future. More often, they didn't. One night, as rain tapped softly against the windows, Grace stood in the doorway of Victor's study and said the words she had rehearsed 1,000 times. "I'm leaving." Victor didn't look surprised. "For how long, I don't know," she admitted. "I need to see who I am when I'm not defined by survival." He nodded. "Then you should go." Grace hesitated. "You're not stopping me." "No," Victor said simply. "Because if you stay, it should be because you choose to, not because you feel safe only here." Something loosened in her chest at that. Gratitude, affection, something deeper she wasn't ready to name. She left before dawn. Weeks passed. Victor returned to the city slowly, deliberately. His presence no longer inspired the same fear, but something steadier replaced it. Respect, certainty, the knowledge that when Victor Crane drew a line, it held. Then one evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the skyline in gold, Grace walked back through the gates. No disguise. No urgency. Victor was waiting. "You came back," he said. "Yes." Why? Grace considered the question carefully. "Because I went everywhere I thought would feel like freedom, and none of it felt like home." Victor didn't speak. He only watched her, the weight of that word settling quietly between them. She stepped closer. "I don't need protection anymore, and I don't belong to anyone." Victor met her gaze. "I wouldn't want you to." Silence stretched, gentle and unafraid. "Then stay," he said, not as an order, not as a request, simply as an invitation. Grace smiled, truly smiled, for the first time since she had entered his world. "I already have." He reached for her then, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. When his hand closed around hers, the contact felt less like possession and more like recognition. Two lives intersecting not out of necessity, but choice. They didn't rush anything after that. There was no dramatic declaration, no need for promises sharpened by desperation. What grew between them was quieter, stronger, built on nights of shared silence and mornings that no longer began with fear. Months later, the olive tree bloomed. Grace stood beside Victor in the garden, fingers entwined with his, watching the leaves catch the light. "I never thought I'd stay anywhere," she said. Victor squeezed her hand gently. "Neither did I." Together, they looked toward the city not as ruler and survivor, but as two people who had learned, at last, how to choose something beyond survival. And this time, neither of them walked away.